I'm pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Gabby Berlaku, who's the Talent Research Manager at Accenture. Gabby has been leading a major project looking at a number of features of effective organizational and talent management, with particular respect to how the workplace is changing. She also has a background in more traditional kinds of research, and I think is bringing that kind of research expertise to her current survey work through Accenture. Dr. Berlaku.
Thank you so much. That was a lovely introduction. I'm unable to share my video for some reason, as the host has stopped it, but I am here.
Okay, so we're working on it right now. So
Great. Okay. Well, I will start then by sharing my screen, and hopefully you'll be able to see me as needed. All right.
so we see your slides properly. So
Wonderful.
yeah.
Okay, and I'll try start video one last time, and I think that did it.
Yeah, we see you.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much, everybody, for being here today. Thanks so much to the organizers of this wonderful event. I've gotten to listen in on some of the other sessions, and they've been phenomenal. Today, I'm here to talk to you about supporting workers' human needs to leave them net better off. And in particular, I'm going to share some research that my team and I have done on this topic. As was mentioned, my name is Gabby Berlaku. I am a research manager at a company called Accenture. So today, and hopefully this isn't in your way. So today I'm going to share a little bit about what Accenture Research does and what my team and I focus on. Then we'll get right into the heart of what it means to leave workers net better off and what our research has shown. And then go into 3 things that we've learned about how you can actually achieve this in your business. And then, time willing, any questions that you have for me, I would love to start a dialogue. So, you may have heard of Accenture. They are a massive professional services organization that works with businesses all over the globe from a consulting perspective on all sorts of different business topics. Accenture Research is the thought leadership arm of Accenture. So, we get to do really interesting research studies on all sorts of things that organizations and business leaders care about. The really nice thing about this is that while Accenture works with clients, and that tends to be a paid engagement, Accenture research is more publicly available. So as a researcher, I'm able to come to conferences and share some of our insights with you. And a lot of our research is actually publicly available. And so there's certainly today, some of the research I'll be talking about will be linked so you can access it, but we've got lots of other great research reports as well that you can access, not necessarily having to be a client of Accenture's. So my team focuses on what we call talent and organization topics. So we're really, really focused on the workforce and what's changing, how the work experience is changing, but especially what the work experience is in relation to things like mental and physical health. And we've been conducting research since before the pandemic, but certainly during the pandemic to understand how that was shifting. So here's what we're finding. Essentially, Accenture researchers were able to quantify all of the stuff that's coming at organizations today. And what they found was that economic, social, environmental, technological, geopolitical, consumer disruption increased by 200% between the 2017 and 2022 timeframe. So in the last 5 years, this disruption that's hitting our businesses has increased by 200%. And as a comparison point, in the 5 years prior to that, this quantified sort of disruption only went up by 4%. So if it feels like everything is very crazy right now, this basically illuminates why we are experiencing things at a rate that we've never experienced before. And one of the things that my team and I have been able to track over this time is that not only is it a hard time to be a business leader, but it's a really hard time to be a worker in organizations as well, because workers can feel this instability and this disruption, and it is manifesting itself in different attitudes in different ways. So we've seen a few stats about burnout and stress earlier in this session, or in this conference rather, but here are some that come from us. We found that 30% of workers see a link between their work and their company's broader purpose. That's a really small number. Only 29%, even fewer, trust that their company's leaders are making decisions with their best interests at heart. Only 1 in 6 workers feels a really strong sense of connection to holistically different aspects of their work, things like the work they do, their team, their organization, and even more compelling, 42% of workers don't feel a strong sense of connection to any one of those things. So they are just completely disconnected from their work. And of course, exhaustion is increasingly becoming an issue. So we track certain things over time, like work-life enhancement, which means that the energy that people bring from their personal lives to their work is trending downward. We attribute that a lot to just the cumulative impact of all of these different things that are going on. So we're seeing a real effect in the workplace. So COVID-19 obviously was one of these mega disruptions that changed how work is done and changed how businesses function. And we did see actually one positive thing come out of this, which is that business leaders at the executive level are starting to think differently about what it means to employ people and what it means to support people. So prior to the pandemic, we saw that about 1 in 3 executive level people said, yes, I recognize that we're moving past that traditional employment contract where I work, you pay, and to something more in terms of what it means to employ and support people. During the pandemic, this actually went up. So now about 1 in 2 executives do believe that they do bear responsibility for supporting people in a more holistic way. And so this got us thinking, what does that look like and what are the ways in which people need to be supported? And so we started with in-depth interviews with 35 subject matter experts, business leaders, and academic experts in this field. We then validated those findings with surveys of over 21,000 workers and 3,900 executive level leaders across 10 industries, 10 countries, so all over the world, all different job types, to try to understand what this looks like. And here is ultimately what we found. We found that what workers ultimately need from a holistic care perspective is to be left net better off as a result of working for their company across 6 key areas. And before I get into the 6, I want to talk a little bit about this model of net better off, because it has its roots in things like net profitability and net promoter score. And so those things are really looking at what is positive that's left over once some of the costs and things have been taken out, right? And so in that same way, this model really looks at work as a work does take from people, right? So it takes their time, it takes their energy. During the pandemic, it required some risk to mental and physical health. But even if you can agree that work is taking something from workers, what is it that is positive that's left at the end as a result of working from your company? And that's really what the spirit of the net better off model is. So these are the 6 dimensions, and these were pervasive across all industries, all job types. It didn't matter your organizational level. It didn't matter if you were entry level, just starting out, or if you were the CEO. These are the things that matter to you in the workplace. And they were being emotionally and mentally supported. So feeling positive emotions and maintaining mental wellness, feeling relationally supported, feeling a strong sense of belonging and inclusion, and having strong interpersonal relationships at work, being physically supported, so being in good physical health and stress management falls under here. Feeling purposefully supported, so feeling that one is making a positive difference and that you're connected to a purpose that's larger than just yourself. Feeling employably supported, so working in a place that gives you marketable, in demand capabilities and skills that you can apply to your next job, your next organization. And finally, feeling financially supported. So being financially secure without undue economic stress, having equitable opportunity for future stability and advancement. Again, these 6 components we found again and again and again to be really, really pervasive in terms of the places that workers need to be left better off as a result for working for their company. One of the things we did was try to analyze how much does this really matter. Obviously, workers would like to be supported in these different areas. All six are important, but what is happening for organizations that get this right? And what we found is that being supported across these six areas leads to all sorts of positive outcomes and behaviors from a worker perspective. So if you look across the bottom of this graphic, you see things like, I would recommend my employer to others. I trust my employer. I want to work there for a long time. I feel fully inspired and motivated. All of these were significantly driven by the extent to which people felt supported across these net better off dimensions. But what is really interesting and I think compelling here is the way to read this graphic is that those dimensions across the top in the darker purple are stronger predictors of some of these statements and sentiments than the ones maybe on the bottom that are a little bit lighter, still important, still significant, but not quite as important in driving those behaviors. And so if you look at what emerges as most important, you see that for people to want to recommend their employer to others, they need to be emotionally and relationally supported. For them to want to stay for a long time, they need to be relationally and emotionally supported. For them to feel fully inspired and motivated, they need to feel connected to a purpose and emotionally and relationally supported. And so, what I think is really interesting about this is that financial support tends to fall to the bottom for all of these different outcomes. And when you think about what was going on in the Great Resignation and how workers were finding a new sense of purpose and wanting to work with companies that aligned with their purpose, and money was often the solution that companies applied. Okay, if people are leaving, we'll just pay them more, we'll just offer them something to stay. I think this perfectly encapsulates why methods like that didn't necessarily work. To feel financially supported by your organization is important, but it may not be as important in some of these other things for driving those more positive outcomes and behaviors. We did find as well that companies that got this right in terms of supporting their workers did see a revenue increase as compared to their peers, because it was through these kinds of actions, through this kind of productivity and better job satisfaction that they were driving by better supporting their workers. Besides the positive outcomes we found, we also found that, quite frankly, this is something that workers are increasingly coming to expect from their organizations. So I mentioned that prior to the pandemic, it was only about 1 in 3 executives said, yes, I understand that we need to support workers in more holistic ways. And then that number grew to about 1 in 2, or about 50% of executives. But worker sentiment around their organization's responsibility for supporting them in these ways has always exceeded, and we do track this over time, it has always exceeded what executives think their responsibility was. So before the pandemic, we found that about 2/3 of workers said their organization is strongly responsible for helping them be better off across those 6 dimensions. During the pandemic, we found that this increased to almost 80%. And this continues to increase as workers look to work for organizations that align with their values. So we're seeing that a huge majority of workers are asking their companies for this and expecting this. So how are business leaders going to mobilize to be able to better support their workers in these ways? So now that we've covered what Net Better Off is, where the different aspects of focus in terms of where workers need to be supported and left better off for their companies, and what outcomes can be driven when that happens, we did a lot of research to try to understand how can companies actually change some aspect of their culture, of their policies, of their practices to actually leave workers net better off. What works? And I'm here today to share 3 things from the research. So, the very first thing we found is that it is far more effective to focus on the good, not the bad, when leaving workers better off, net better off. And the way we found this was actually really interesting. So, a couple of years into the pandemic, we were asked to conduct research on remote work productivity. Of course, this was top of mind for everybody. And we were asked to figure out, what is it that helps workers be productive in a remote work setting? Is it different from how they're productive in an on site work setting? What can we learn about remote work and making it work for businesses, essentially? And we did find some interesting differentiators there. But one of the things that we found that was really unexpected and interesting is that there was consistently a segment of workers that were just very highly productive and mentally healthy and happy and satisfied in either location. They felt that way, whether they were on site, whether they were remote or hybrid, something in between. We called these our productive anywheres. They were just off the charts. But we also found an opposite group to them. We found workers that were really unproductive, really mentally unhealthy, and really unhappy. And it didn't matter if they had the opportunity to work remotely, if they came on site, if they had the opportunity to do something in between. These were our productive nowheres. They just couldn't get the job done. And so we kind of moved away from trying to understand what's the difference between remote and on-site work and more toward what is the difference between these two groups? Because to be productive and happy and healthy anywhere should be the goal. And what's going on with this group that just can't do it in any location? Our hypothesis was they must be super burned out. Terrible things must have happened to them during this pandemic, and it's the negative things that are really creating that difference. But here's what we actually found. We found that workers will feel more supported, happy, and healthy when they have more resources, not necessarily when they have fewer challenges, which was really a surprise to the research team. So what you see here on the slide is the increased likelihood of being in that productive anywhere group when this condition is present in their work experience. So for instance, if you have access to learning and development opportunities, you are 36% more likely to be in that productive anywhere group. If you feel you have a sense of autonomy in your job, you're 35% more likely. If you have supportive leadership, you're 32% more likely. Strong social relationships at work, you're 27% more likely. But if you look toward the bottom of this chart, so the individual is able to avoid burnout. This led to a just 6% greater likelihood that you would be productive anywhere. And I believe that that actually wasn't statistically significant. So what that means for all practical intents and purposes is that there is no difference in burnout between those productive anywhere folks and those people who are productive nowhere. So that was really interesting. Even more interesting, we found that when the individual was able to avoid experiencing microaggressions at work, they were actually less likely to be productive anywhere. So put another way, those productive anywhere folks had actually experienced more microaggressions, but somehow they managed to be happy, healthy, and productive in any physical location. And so what this quickly led us to discover was that it's actually those positive resources, those opportunities for autonomy, support, social relationships, learning and development that really make the difference and kind of help buffer against some of those negative work experiences. So the thing is, especially during the pandemic, but even beyond as we deal with so many different things, you're always going to have some negative at work. You can't possibly temper burnout for every individual. You can't avoid stress. Work is going to come at a cost, as I mentioned before, with the net better off model and kind of the philosophy behind it. But the more that you're able to really infuse the positive into the work experience of individuals, the more that you see that they're able to be productive, happy, healthy, and net better off. So that's insight number one. Insight number two was also quite interesting to us. We found that workers will be better off in organizations where there is shared accountability across the leadership team for leaving them net better off. So I mentioned before that now it's about 1 in 2 executives that does believe that they bear personal responsibility for better supporting workers in more holistic ways. But what I didn't mention is that a whole lot of them are HR executives. So you see relatively few business leaders really carrying personal accountability for some of these things as you do HR, because net better off tends to be a people issue. And so why not, have it be an issue that the people function solves? But interestingly, one area that business leaders do get that they have personal accountability for is in that aspect of leaving workers financially better off. So, time and time again, we see that CEOs agree that they are responsible for leaving workers financially better off, and maybe less so that they are responsible for leaving workers emotionally better off or purposefully better off or some of the other dimensions. However, one of the things that we've noticed is that when leaders outside of HR see themselves as accountable for leaving workers financially better off, workers in those companies actually are financially better off. So that got us thinking, is there something to be said for that shared accountability that's helping actually drive results? And what we found actually is that there is. So we looked at this idea of leaving workers emotionally and mentally better off. And we found that about 34% of CHROs feel personally responsible for the emotional health of their company's workers. I wish this was higher, but that just is what we found. We also found that 26% of CEOs feel that same personal responsibility for the emotional health of their company's workers. When we looked at companies where the CHRO and CEO both agreed that they were personally responsible for this, and we looked at workers within that company, they said that they are emotionally better off as compared to companies where maybe this wasn't the case. So it was really clear to us that the more that leadership teams agree, and we've now looked at positions beyond just the CEO, the more that the actual experience of the company's workers improves. And we found that actually we're continuing to investigate exactly through what mechanisms this happens, but ultimately the sort of hidden third variable here is that when companies have leaders that all carry accountability for this traditionally people issue, it tends to be because they don't operate in, really traditional functional silos, but rather the leadership team is sort of more boundaryless and more a team that together tackles organizational challenges. What we're actually finding is that organizations that operate in those more boundaryless ways right now are doing better revenue wise than their peers. My theory on this is that life is messy, and organizations that are operating in really clean functions aren't able to, quickly pivot and meet the needs of a very changing market. So obviously more work to be done then, and that's kind of a different topic than what we're talking about now, but we are seeing positive aspects of having more leaders take personal accountability for these traditional people issues, and we are seeing that it does lead to an improved net better off experience among workers. The final lesson that we've learned we call formalize or don't. So when we talk about some of the dimensions of net better off, I think one of the tendencies for HR organizations is to say, okay, this is going to be very formal and very programmatic and likely very expensive. So in the case of mental and emotional health, it's going to be, a big mental health training that people need to do outside of their work. It's going to be something additional. And it's going to be difficult to kind of design and put into place. And one of the things that we're finding increasingly is that that is one way to increase the net better off experience of your workers, but it's not the only way. And quite honestly, there are many ways to kind of go to the drawing board and make small incremental changes to the nature of how work is done in your business that actually ends up supporting people a little bit better than, say, some additional program. So at the time that this research was initially conducted, it was the heart of the pandemic, and we had developed a set of questions for HR and business leaders to kind of ask themselves as they think about what incremental changes they can start making toward becoming more of a net better off focused organization. And so these are a little bit pandemic focused, right? Like emotional mental on the very bottom is how can we support the ongoing mental resilience of our people when the potential trauma from the crisis may have lasting effects? Well, now we're in the lasting effects stage, but I think this practice of kind of outlining questions of where are we today in terms of supporting workers on this and how can we make some small changes to move toward better supporting them is very, very effective. Another thing to consider here with these 6 dimensions is a potential measurement strategy. So if you could measure how supported your people feel across these 6 and understand where there might be some, some pitfalls or some challenges, you'd be able to make sort of more intentional investments and decisions. If you are going to do a big expensive program, which dimension should it be aligned to? You would know through a measurement strategy. And the one final thing I'll say too here about this informal approach to becoming a net better off focused organization. I personally had a team leader that used to use these dimensions as a framework for driving team calls. So during the pandemic, she would ask us, Where are you feeling really strong and where are you feeling like you could use some extra support? And obviously, there needs to be a lot of psychological safety on the team to have that kind of discussion. But one of the things that we quickly found on my team is that we were struggling with the relational element. We all felt pretty isolated. Many of us had never met in person. And thereby, first of all, we felt heard. But second of all, she had information for how to better structure team meetings and events and potential social events through that knowledge. And that was so informal. That wasn't an HR initiative. That wasn't HR at all. That was just a team leader kind of taking this information into her own leadership style. And it had such a profound impact on me that I wanted to share it with you today. So it can be small things. We also, when we first conducted this research, took a look at 30 different HR and organizational practices because we wanted to understand if, aside from launching some big program, what can you do differently in terms of the practices and policies of the organization that might leave people net better off? So this again gets to the idea of how is work actually done, what is actually rewarded, and how is this infused into the culture of the organization? And we ultimately found 5 practices that we're elevating as sweet spot practices because they sit right at that sweet spot of leaving people net better off, but also improving organizational revenue growth potential, right? It's good for people and it's good for the business. And these sweet spot practices were enabling a culture of continuous learning. So, again, this isn't necessarily touching on physical health, emotional, mental health, relational health, but it's just a way of supporting workers in such a way that they feel better off as a result of working for the company. Listening, engaging in employee listening all the way down to the front lines, using technology to enable flexibility at scale, championing workforce well-being and equality, setting and sharing people metrics, being really, really transparent about what the organization's people goals are and where you are on the way to those goals. Again, these are things that don't perfectly align to those 6 dimensions of net better off, but they have this effect of making people feel more connected and trusting of the organization and therefore more supported in some of those ways. So I know I've thrown a lot of information out here today. My team is very passionate about this topic and I could go on, but I do want to summarize what we've covered. Basically, our research conducted with over 21,000 workers and 3,900 executives found 6 fundamental human needs that workers have, workers of all kinds in all geos and all industries have that organizations can and should influence. And that's emotional, mental, relational, physical, financial, employable, and leaving them with purpose. We covered that leaving workers better off across these 6 dimensions leads to all sorts of great outcomes, and that companies can get started on better supporting workers in these 6 ways by focusing on the positive resources they can embed into the worker experience and maybe less on taking away the negative, by educating and aligning leaders on their shared accountability for leaving workers net better off as a result of working for the company, and by taking incremental steps to design work in a way that is more supportive of holistic worker health instead of or in addition to formal programs. You will receive this deck, and if you click on the image here, you can see the original research report where we first surfaced the net better off model. However, we continue to track these trends over time, so please do reach out if you're interested in seeing some more recent research or hearing kind of how this thinking has elevated over time. But in the meantime, I thank you all so much for listening and would love to hear what questions you have for me.
Thank you, Gabby, for a very inspiring and eloquent presentation. We do have time for a number of questions, and we've had one brave person who's already put one question forward. So I will just articulate that. Number 1, are there any tools to measure net better off dimensions similar to engagement surveys?
So there are, and they would be marketed by Accenture. So they are, and they cost money, is what I would say. I would also say, though, that being able to see those dimensions and how we define them in the research report could lead to your own tool. I know that we have created at Accenture some diagnostics that get in a little bit deeper, especially to those sweet spot practices and the extent to which your company does or does not utilize them. But it is part of a larger client engagement, and I really don't want to sell Accenture offerings here today, as I know that's not the purpose. So I recommend taking some of the concepts and creating your own. Um, and Accenture.com will have more information about anything else.
All right. Well, again, I want to encourage people. There have been many sort of real appreciative remarks about your talk. And I guess maybe they heard that first thing, focus on the positive, not on the negative. So we won't talk about the time you fumbled your words or whatever. But but guys, I need some more questions. Now, I do have one question for you, and this is, speaking as a researcher, the survey results that you found, I really like the process. You said you consulted a bunch of experts. You came up with a design of a questionnaire that was, valid in terms of its conceptualization, because you consulted a bunch of people, and then you went out across the world, 21,000 workers, almost 4,000 executives, and you collected the data. So what happens with research, and it's very, exciting findings, but what often happens with research is people publish, but then the results, even if they're good results, often sit on a shelf and aren't operationalized. Now, that's a problem more with academia than with the business world. So broadly speaking, how do you see implementation of the findings of your research?
And it's a great question and a great point about research, because it the cycle can feel very slow, and it is quite accelerated in applied research and business compared to academic research, and still it feels like we were working on this months before it finally received a publication. Fortunately, I would say that this stuff really stands the test of time. As I mentioned, we continue measuring some of these net better off dimensions over time as we've moved beyond the pandemic and into the next crisis, as we call them perma crises now. It's just the state that we're in. And this is really something that remains important for workers. Now, I will say one of the questions I've gotten in the past is, okay, why these six, and how is that different from my organization's, four-pronged model, or Maslow's hierarchy of needs, or
Right.
McClelland's theory of needs? And I think the one strength of the net better off model was that it was intended to be in the language of the business and not necessarily even in the language of HR. So remember how I talked about that it's really, really important to educate and align leaders on that this should be important to them as well. If they've got people under them, they need to be supporting their people and leaving them better off. And it was for that reason that we spoke to business leaders initially to try to understand what their language is related to certain things. So, for instance, skilling. We know all about learning and development as HR professionals. Maybe now in an applied setting, we call it skilling. But what is in the net better off model is leaving workers more employable. So, business leaders can absolutely wrap their minds around what it takes to be more employable, and maybe less so when they hear learning and development or skilling, they think, okay, HR's problem. So I think that this had the strength of really presenting some of these concepts in dialogue that business leaders that would resonate with business leaders maybe outside of the HR space.
All right. So that's very helpful. We do have some questions, and one I'm going to extrapolate a little bit from this question. So I'll read the question and then I'll extrapolate from it. So in the survey, were there specific stories that came out which were memorable to you? And the way I would extrapolate on that is in earlier presentations, we've highlighted the need for the narrative or the story in addition to quantitative data from a survey. And I'm just curious whether informally or formally, was there any attempt to collect stories in this line of research?
It is an ongoing effort to kind of collect stories of companies doing this quote unquote right, which takes a number of different forms. One of the co-sponsors of the research was Marriott, actually, and so I think that they've included some information about how they're doing this right. The things that were most memorable to me probably are that for the wrong reason. Like, I consistently remember that insight that CEOs see themselves as responsible for leaving people financially better off, but not as much those other pieces, like that continued sort of traditional thinking about what this employment contract is. Because for decades, it's been a very traditional workers work, we pay, end of relationship. And that's really shifting on its head a little bit, the pandemic having accelerated that, but continuing to see how many business leaders outside of HR still don't necessarily see that as their problem. To me, that is very memorable, and could tell an endless story, not for very positive reasons.
Well, if I may, as a researcher, suggest this, it would be nice for you to do essentially the same presentation you did today to a group of business leaders who have not heard, this kind of work, and then do a focus group of what they think of these results and
Yeah,
what they whether they think that it will influence them one way or another. That might be another project for
I
your
think that's
team.
excellent. Yes.
And the same thing with employees. Like, how does the findings of this survey? What do employees think? Like, this
Mhm.
is like the ultimate validation of the research when you share the results back with the subjects of the research, so to speak. What do they think? Does it make sense? Do the findings make sense to them? That might be a nice way to round out the entire presentation,
Really
or
great.
the
Yeah.
research portfolio, around this topic. So we have another comment here that suppose you're an employee in a company. Are there any thoughts to share on helpful grassroots efforts that employees can do to encourage employee well-being along the dimensions you've mentioned when higher ups are slow to prioritize net better off principles?
I do think it's important, right? And it's important to think about these six things as things we want to care about and we want to feel supported, which means our coworkers do too, right? So I think that there's basic ways that we can engage with each other that are a little bit more mindful of this level of support, than others. I did mention my team leader, who did an exceptional job of just bringing the stuff informally into team meetings and making us feel very supported in a way that wasn't, tracked anywhere. It wasn't formal at all. I also could see potentially things getting a little out of control. Right. So you don't want a ton of grassroots movements that move up and maybe violate policies or things like that. Um, so I think, a culture that encourages people to carry some of these things forward, maybe thinking through some of the things that we can influence for one another. For instance, relational better off. That's all about the relationships we build at work. I think that there's absolutely nothing wrong with building, respectful, positive relationships. Um, but it is difficult to say, should we now be tackling all six of these issues in ways that our companies aren't ready for or don't support? I'm not quite ready to fully stand behind that.
Okay.
But there are ways, there are small ways to make, work a better place for one another, and I think that falls right into this.
Again, if I can share an academic perspective on this, one way to change doctor behaviors is to educate patients on something so that they go in asking a
Mm,
certain kind of question to their doctor. So, the same thing is, it's almost like to extend it here. If you had a version of this report that was just drilled down to like really basics and shared it with employees, and employees were felt like saying, hey, to their managers, hey, have you seen this interesting research that says, this particular thing helps everybody, helps the person feel better and helps productivity. That's another way for grassroots discussion, as it were, to start percolating up. And I can tell you, in the medical field, that's a highly effective way to change conservative doctor behaviors.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yes, I really like that. And yeah, there were financial impact findings, which I didn't harp on too much here because we know that this is the right thing to do. And we don't need to be convinced that our companies will make money as a result of better supported and thereby more productive people. But there is that component. And I think sometimes, sadly, that is the message that gets across to leaders. So yeah, the more that we can educate anybody to get them that message, I think the more we'll see some action here.
Okay, well, we're at time. I think on behalf of the audience, I think we're all better off for having attended this workshop. And we just have short closing remarks. So we have a 5-minute break. If you're able to hang in there, get some more tea or stretch your legs. I promise you the last closing remarks are only 5 or 10 minutes. And in those remarks, we're really trying to highlight some of the key messages that all of us have learned today. So see you in